Chapter 22, The Circle. We were up early the next day, unsure of where to begin a day without running. Very quickly, though, the work of the main camp took over. We spent the morning in assigned chores, gathering water from the rain barrels to boil, coaxing the small vegetables in the garden to stay alive, washing clothes, checking the trap lines, and soon it was lunch and everyone came together in the clearing to eat. You guys planning a rescue for your elder? Clarence had sat beside me in a spot where the grass was soft. He was eating dried meat. I had made him promise earlier to teach me how to dry and smoke meat so we could keep it longer when the hunt wasn't so good. I nodded, not wanting to talk anymore since the asshole from yesterday had sauntered over. Clarence followed my gaze to the boy. "This is my nephew Derek," he told me. "We traveled together from out west. He's a good hunter." By then, he was standing in front of us. I had to put my hand up along my brow to block out the sun to see him. I didn't like it, looking up at him. I wanted to stand, but I didn't want him to think that I needed to get up to prove anything. "The best, Uncle. I'm the best hunter." He smirked and he lightly kicked the bottom of Clarence's boot with the toe of his own. Yeah, and he's real humble, too," Clarence laughed. "Derek, you know Jean's boy, Francis, eh?" "French," I corrected. "Yeah, sure. I know Francis. I escorted him over here yesterday." He made air quotes around the word, escorted. Whatever. Big man with a gun. I decided to ignore him, looking back down at my bowl of salted potatoes. He didn't deserve my attention. "No, Francis. I'm a big man always. Don't need a gun, though I'm capable of using one when I have to." Clarence cut the boy off. "Okay, Derek, why don't you go get yourself some food over there?" "Yeah, I think I will go get some food, Uncle. I have to check the lines this afternoon. Someone has to feed the women." He stretched out his arm and puffed out his chest before leaving, blocking out the sun so that I was thrown into his shadow. "Don't mind him. He's just looking for something to rub his antlers on. You know what I mean?" Clarence clapped me on the back. "Plus, you have girls in your group. He's just looking to prove himself." He ripped off another hunk of meat and chewed it thoughtfully, looking around the clearing. Suddenly, I wasn't hungry anymore. I swallowed what was in my mouth and I excused myself. I handed my bowl off to Slopper and a small boy his age named Sam, who were assigned the dishwashers for the meal, and wandered over to the lodge, planning to walk the perimeter of the clearing just to check things out. I still felt uneasy. Maybe I just needed to get a better handle on where we were and what was ahead of us. I sure as hell didn't want to think about where we'd been and what I'd done. And now we were here with this group, and there was this ass who was trying to impress the girls by being a dick to me. What was up with that? I walked at a brisk pace to avoid the others. I needed to think. "Hey, wait for me." Rose jogged over. Her hair was pulled back in a loose bun that bounced like a pom-pom on a toque as she ran. I kept walking, a little slower than before. "Where are you going?" She caught up and walked beside me. "Thanks for waiting. Geez. Nowhere." She was walking at my pace, swinging her arms and kicking the rocks along the way. I made my way over to the hill and started its incline, dotted with low shrubs and a thin veil of elm trees. "Well, what are you doing?" "Nothing." "Nothing?" I just nodded, making my way through the bush, but still behind the tree so I had a better view of the green bowl of the clearing. Why did things still feel so uncertain even after I'd found my dad? It'd been years since I'd even allowed myself the fantasy of imagining he was still alive, and yet here we were, together, and still. I didn't realize until I'd walked a few feet that Rose was no longer with me. I turned and saw her at the bottom, arms crossed, hip thrown out. "You comin'?" "Well, do you want me to?" I shrugged. "Up to you." She unfolded her arms and placed them on her hips. Then she turned on a heel and stomped away. I shrugged again and walked in the opposite direction. Tonight's social night over in the cave. General was visiting with Migwans when I returned to our group's circle of tents, and they were chatting in the last moments of daylight. General, a pleasant-looking man who wore his gray hair at shoulder length and had a neck hung with beaded ropes. He smiled a lot, the kind of smile that went right up into his eyes, and maybe for this reason alone I agreed to follow them over to the cave and check out the festivities. When we got there, they were still cleaning up and placing seating in a circle, facing inwards towards the center of the space. I excused myself from the two men and made my way over to my father's room. Since the door was a blanket and the walls were mostly fabric, I knocked on the wooden frame around the draped doorway. "Dad?" "Come in." He was sitting on the bed, wrapping his damaged leg in a tensor bandage. He smiled when I entered. He was wearing a long undershirt that had been black at one time but was now faded to gray, and what looked like a pair of tropical print swimming trunks that hung wide on his thighs. His damp hair was freshly cut, and he smelled like good soap. Boy, I could get used to hearing Dad again, let me tell you. He patted the mattress beside him, and I sat down, sighing as he did. We sat there for a minute, in silence. "Boy, what's the matter?" I couldn't answer. Instead, I shrugged, slumping my shoulders again, so I put my elbows on my knees and hold my face in my hands. You sure look like something's the matter. I couldn't answer him because I wasn't really sure what was wrong. On top of that, I felt guilty that I wasn't happier. We'd found Minerva. Now all we had to do was get her from the recruiters. And I'd found my dad after all this time. It really was two miracles in one, and all I could do was feel sad and confused. The other two had been crafted with a wooden frame hung with wool blankets. The structure had a roof, an old hospital blanket that sealed in the idea of privacy if nothing else. In the space was a cot and a small shelf made from planks of wood, separated with cut logs and filled with books, folded clothes, papers, and some braided and bunched herbs. His rosary beads hung from the corner of his shelf, and in between a pile of cards and a stack of spineless books was a framed plastic ID card. I went in close, checking that he was still busy behind the screen first. It was my mother's health card, the green plastic embedded with white letters that spelled out her name, Mary E. Dusome. Sex, female. Date of birth, 03/15/2027. Issued, 04/11/2049. The rectangle for her picture was harder to make out. It was dark with age and wear, like she'd been standing in the shadows even then. He returned, his eyes half closed even as he spoke, leaning on a carved crutch that curved under his arm like a smooth cradle. The reunion, the sweat, the long day had all taken their toll. He wore a pair of gray sweatpants and a droopy wife beater that showed the sagging skin on his arms and the strength still hard in his chest. It also revealed a series of scars knotted like bark up his side, around to his back, and climbing up his neck and into the back of his hairline. Nah, I'm okay. Just gonna help the crew with their stuff. Maybe I'll sneak in after. He nodded, pulled me in with one ropey arm for another hug, and patted me hard on the back, digging his chin into the crook of my collarbone so that I knew he was working out the reality of my physical presence. I turned to leave, pausing at the exit. Dad? Yeah? He was lowering himself onto a cot. Mitch gave himself to them so that I could get away. Mom couldn't. Dad hung his head, perched on the edge of his cot, knuckles flat against the mattress like a resting gorilla, so that his shoulders sat high by his ears. He didn't say anything. It was too much right now. Maybe soon we can talk about them, eh? Real soon, French. He kept his face tilted towards the floor. Real soon. I was exhausted, but we needed to talk. Others knew it, and when I returned they were already sitting at the fire. Somebody had thoughtfully helped Slopper with his tent, and he was already passed out inside of it. I could hear his reedy snore through the canvas. You staying out here? Tree seemed surprised, but also a bit relieved. Yeah, I'm still part of this family, aren't I? Yeah, Zegwin answered. It's just that you have a real family now. Real? What's that supposed to mean? You're not real? I picked up a stone by my foot. So this won't hurt then. And I chucked it at him through the fire. Ow, geez, he rubbed his shin, where it had bounced off his shin. All right, we're real, he laughed. So we need to figure out some things then, I guess. I addressed Meg, who was sitting up very straight, staring at the low flames. No, not really, and I was surprised by his answer. What do you mean? It was Rose. Don't we need a plan? Sure we do, he replied. But the end is the same. We are going to get Minerva. French was led here by that belief, and it turned out to be a good one. Minerva is close by, and he found his dad. That's a pretty overwhelming sign that we're on the right path. I think I expected more hesitation and maybe a story or 7 about what happened at the schools. Not that Mig was weak or cowardly, not at all. Just that we expected him to be more skeptical, to calm our feverish ambition, to be the voice of steadfast reason. Instead, we found a tired old man and a cooperative soldier all wrapped up in one Indian. It was like he had faded, somehow. I just mean the dreams, the words. Don't we need to talk about Minerva finding the key? She didn't find anything. She already had it. Maybe we just need to be better listeners. I pressed him. What about strategy, a plan? Shouldn't we be mounting an attack now, while it's dark? This isn't my territory. Tomorrow we can meet with the council and figure things out from there. He yawned and walked out of the ring of light thrown by the fire. Right now, I need sleep. We're off too. I wasn't sure Tree and his brother had picked up on the subtle shift in Mig. They stood and made their way over to the tent, more in unison when they were tired than any other time, and I noticed their cap was on neither head. Maybe that was it. Maybe we were all just exhausted. It'd been another day on the run, another day of being woken up by strangers in our space, and then at the same time, a day unlike any that we'd had. Hell, I was tired. Wob started the work of putting out the fire safely, but she had an odd serenity in her movements. Cheeboy began his usual end-of-the-night patrol. I turned towards the steady drone of Slopper's snore before Rose grabbed my arm, just above the elbow. "Can you come to my place for a minute?" The invitation knocked some of my anxiety out of my limbs. I rarely got to spend time with Rose. We were a sad, rushed bunch these days, but the slightest touch and I was right back to being a teenage boy with the biggest crush in the world. And I thought maybe it might be more than a crush, what with the afternoon by the river, but I couldn't be sure. Everything was hot and cold and horrifying and hopeful. Terror is an odd bedfellow. Sure. I crawled into the tent after her and was immediately struck by how empty it was. There was one bedroll in the middle of the space. Against the back wall were her bags, one open with a couple pieces of clothing pulled out. Beside her bed was a small solar-powered lamp that cast a moon glow that didn't quite reach the corners. In here I could smell the angst and the earth and awkward of my own body, and I was embarrassed. I stayed by the door while she crawled to the back wall. "You okay?" I wasn't sure I was. "Yeah." "That's crazy, eh? Finding your dad?" "Yep." She examined my face for a moment before continuing. "I think Meg is a bit worried." "About rescuing Minerva?" I started to pull off my sweater. It was warm in here. "No." She tilted her head and thought. "No, I don't think so. I think it's more about you." "Me?" I paused, my sweater halfway over my head. "What about me?" "Well, you've changed." I was quiet. Had I really changed? After all, I didn't feel changed. I just felt less, or maybe it was more, not changed so much as living at a different volume. And I think even though it's great that we found your dad, well, you know what happens when we find family. Now she sounded worried. She dropped her beautiful face so that the waves of her hair covered half of it. I wanted so badly to move it aside. I wanted so badly to kiss her again. And I couldn't tell her I wouldn't leave, that I would never leave, but I couldn't. The memories I carried from that day I'd had with my parents were kept in the cradle boards in my mind, situated in complete safety, even the bad ones. In them, there's always this feeling, an understanding more than an emotion, of protection. It didn't matter what was happening in the world. My job was to be Frances. That was all, just to remain myself. And now, well, now I had a different family to take care of. My job was to hunt and scout and build camp and break camp, to protect the others. I winced even thinking of it. My failure. I'd failed at protecting, and now, as a result, I'd failed at remaining myself. Maybe I would stay. Maybe it was the only way I could keep my sanity, to stay with my dad and inch my way back to Frances. She made her way, on hands and knees, across her bed and over to me. "I won't ask you to come with us, French. I wouldn't do that to you." She was right in front of me now, her face an inch from mine. She smelled like sweet grass and a deeper smoke. Despite the shock of finding my dad, the odd behavior of Meg, the confusion of the new place and how we arrived, the stress of Minerva's impending rescue, all I wanted to do was kiss this girl, and so I did. She didn't pull away, and so I leaned in until we were pushed back on the layers of blankets that made up her bed. I pulled back to look at her to make sure she was good, and she smiled, grabbed my braid, and brought me back to her. And I can't say how long we were like that before the song interrupted us, but when I caught my breath and came out into the bowl of the valley, it was full dark. It was impossible to ignore for a few reasons. For one, any sort of noise could bring the predators, so we tried to stay quiet. And then there was the song itself that sent me out of the tent. "Do you hear that?" she'd whispered through my hair. I listened. There it was. "Yeah," I responded against her neck. We stayed still, just listening to the shake of the dry seed rattle, alert to danger until the singing began. Migwans. Now I stood near the fire pit and set my feet in the direction of his voice. It was a low, moaning voice, the kind the body used to travel through pain, the kind a child used when they realize the higher-pitched tones used for bringing their mothers isn't working and they are alone after all. From the back entrance of the cave, I saw several guards. They, too, were listening. But since they stayed there by the doorway, I guessed they weren't too concerned, and we weren't in any imminent danger. I found Meg by the southwest wall. He lit a smudge and a candle so that his face was clear in the handful of light and obscured by the handfuls of smoke. I stood back a bit while he sang, knocking his rattle against the air and rocking on his heels where we rested. It was warmer outside now, and the wind in this valley was minimal. Mig wore a t-shirt and black jeans without the burden of coats, and I was reminded of his life outside of us. The scars from his school stay, the tattoo of the feather below his collarbone, the outline of the buffalo on the back of his hand. His hair seemed longer than usual, and the sides had grown in so that he seemed younger, less severe. His duct-tape boots were pulled off of his feet and placed at the edge of the light where he sat. I waited until he was done singing, until after he had mumbled some words and smudged himself. I waited still, while he settled into a more relaxed cross-legged position, and even when he packed up his rattle and a docked feather, I waited. Well, come here then. He didn't look up as he put away his bundle. I came into the light and sat opposite him, mimicking his cross-legged pose. You still up? It was an odd question that he didn't mean, since obviously I was still up. What he meant was, why was I still up? Haven't made it to my tent yet. I meant it to sound nonchalant, but his return smile made me blush. Rose must be lonely in that tent by herself. And I squirmed a bit. It's okay, boy. All I'm going to say is that babies are our most important thing we have to move ahead. So when they come, they need to come to families who want them and are ready to take responsibility. It's not like, we're not. He held up his hand. Don't worry. No need to explain that to me. You're a good man, French. I already know that. We sat in silence for a minute before I switched gears, the uncomfortable subject making it easier to ask what I really wanted to. Mig, are you okay? Are any of us okay? No, really. I leaned in to touch his knee. I needed him to know that I was serious. You seem weird since we got here. Just since we got here? He smirked, then he waved away his own lightheartedness. I know what you mean, French. He gathered the edges of his buckskin bundle and tied them off. Just tired, I guess. All this running. No, I'm more tired of missing Isaac, is all. Just an old man with an old love, I guess. All this talk about Minerva and the schools must have brought up a lot of unresolved feelings for him. I thought about him pouring 100 vials into the ground one by one, mourning his partner. Well, I wasn't sure what to say. We'll get Minerva, and then we'll shut them down, all of them. He looked at me in the eyes, the first time since I'd sat down. I know you will, Francis. I know you will.